Let's go to a whole new time period, and one that we've skipped for good reason up to this point. Today, we're going to take you back to the past,
To play the shitty games that suck ass.
all the way to 1701 and 1941 to examine a samurai tale in the age of World War II.
We would like to thank Clarence Cabanero for recommending today's video by requesting that we cover the samurai films of Kenji Mizoguchi, Akira Kurosawa, or Masaki Kobayashi. All three of these men were big kahunas in the world of post-war Japanese film, and each of them produced at least one massive contribution to the samurai canon. So we figured we ought to cover the biggest of the big out of the bunch. Maybe not in terms of influence this side of the Pacific, but rather in terms of length. Seven Samurai, Harakiri, and others might have cemented the legacies of Kurosawa and Kobayashi, but today's subject, Kenji Mizoguchi's adaptation of The 47 Ronin, made a massive impact on the history of Japanese film, Mizoguchi's career, and how the legend at the center of the film is seen today. Once again, thank you for the recommendation, Clarence, and we hope that we do your suggestion justice with this episode.
The legend of the 47 Ronin dates back to 1701, when the actual events upon which the story is based occurred. Under the military reign of the shogun, the supreme commander of Japan during the era of the samurai, it was recognized that some amount of bureaucracy and hierarchy was needed in order to maintain control over the entire nation. Thus, under the shogun, provincial governors known as daimyo were installed. They were tasked with maintaining their provided areas of Japan and were given control of samurai who served as their foot soldiers. Daimyo were tasked with collecting taxes from the peasants of their provinces as well as policing any disputes that might occur.
On April 21st, 1701, the daimyo of Ako province, Asano Naganori, was put to death for attacking Kira Yoshinaka earlier in the year. Kira was a master of ceremonies who had, according to the tale, egged Asano on intentionally. At the time, it was not uncommon for daimyo to give other officials monetary kickbacks and bribes in exchange for cushy treatment. However, Asano refused to acquiesce, and tensions rose to the point that Asano assaulted Kira after further insults during a ceremony held at the capital in Edo. Given the dishonorable nature of this attack, Asano was sentenced to commit seppuku for his transgressions.
The samurai previously under Asano's rule thus became what were known as Ronin, masterless samurai. They held a secret meeting in honor of Asano's memory, where the proposition was raised that they avenge his wrongful death. Many of his Ronin refused the idea and assumed the leadership of the new daimyo in Ako province. However, 47 of the men proceeded to form a conspiracy against Kira, and these men would become known as the 47 Loyal Ronin.
Over the following 20 months, the 47 Ronin installed themselves in and around Edo. Some donned disguises and ingratiated themselves with the locals, while others funneled in supplies for an all-out raid on Kira's manor. They slowly but surely crafted their plan, ensuring that their mission would succeed with the death of Kira and as little collateral damage as possible. The men knew that they would only have one chance to avenge their master, and that at all costs they could not fail.
On December 14, 1702, nearly 2 years following Asano's ritual suicide, the 47 Ronin donned their disguises and infiltrated Kira's compound, combating more than 100 of his men in the process of searching for the man himself. Once they had at last come across him deep within the mansion, the Ronin offered Kira the opportunity to kill himself honorably in penance for his crimes against Asano. Being dishonorable as he was, however, Kira tried to bribe the men, at which point they killed him themselves. They then took the head of Kira to the grave of Asano as a post-mortem gift to their master, and then turned themselves into the shogun. 3 months later, on February 4th, 1703, the Ronin were commanded to commit seppuku, which they did without hesitation. In this way, all 47 of the Ronin remained loyal to their master until the day they died together.
This incident created quite a stir in the early 1700s, with many siding with Asano's men. They were upheld in this way as exemplars of the Bushido code, the way of the warrior which explained how a samurai could live and die honorably. Others, like Yamamoto Tsunetomo, were far from sympathetic. Tsunetomo was a samurai and the author of the Hagakure, a 1716 book which remains today as one of the primary sources for the study of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Being alive at the time of the incident, Tsunetomo stated that the Ronin had acted dishonorably by delaying their response to Kira for more than a year. His issue wasn't that the Ronin had taken revenge. In his mind, the true samurai act would have been to strike just as resolutely, but much more quickly.
While Tsunetomo might not have seen eye to eye with the 47 Ronin, he would come to share something with them long after his death. After the assassination of Kira and the executions of the Ronin, their story slowly passed into legend. It never entirely disappeared, but became markedly more popular in the late 1800s during the time of the Meiji Restoration. While Japan was opening itself to the West for the first time in centuries, there was an active movement to preserve Japanese culture and defend the nation's people from an overwhelming influx of Western culture. While the fashion, art, and to an extent the government of the time might have been influenced by the West, traditional Japanese arts like flower arranging and older schools of theater saw an increase in popularity as well. Similarly, the spirit of Japaneseness was expressed during this time by bringing back legends of the past, among them that of the 47 Ronin. Their actions at this point were seen in retrospect as representative of the ideal devotion present in the people of Japan.
Similarly, the Hagakure was more or less lost for 2 centuries following its completion. That might be a bit misleading to say, as it wasn't exactly published in the first place during the 1700s. Rather, Tsunetomo wrote the book and kept it among his belongings, almost like a private diary. The Hagakure reads for the most part like a diary or a manifesto, with Tsunetomo expounding on the lessons he had learned from his years of being a samurai, imparting wisdom in any other samurai who might read the book, while also presenting a unique look into the psychology of the samurai class. The book was rediscovered and published widely beginning in the early 1900s, smack dab in the middle of the reign of Emperor Meiji. Throughout the following several decades, it would become a document which would shape military thought and planning, like Ikikita's outline plan for the reorganization of Japan, which we discussed in our episode on coup d'etat.
Over the years, the story of the 47 Ronin has been adapted near countless times, for the stage, on film, in manga and books, in art, on television, and even as an opera in 1997. Each of these adaptations brings something unique to the story, whether it be the sheer length of a 49-episode drama, or a peripheral telling of the tale from Our Little Sister director Hirokazu Koreeda, or Keanu Reeves? The reason that we chose to focus on Mizoguchi's version of the tale, other than the request from Clarence, was the unique time in which the film was produced and released. On that note, let's get into some background on Mizoguchi, which will probably help to frame the significance of this film.
Kenji Mizoguchi is remembered today as one of the Japanese masters of the silent era. He produced nearly 100 films in his lifetime, with the vast majority of them hailing from the 20s and 30s. Meanwhile, he remains perhaps better known for his late period works, released after the close of World War II. Similar to Mikio Naruse, Mizoguchi grew up in abject poverty. In the 1920s, he joined Nikkatsu, where he worked for the majority of his career. Starting in the 1930s, Mizoguchi ventured into the genre he would become perhaps best known for, the women's film. Like Naruse, most of Mizoguchi's heavy hitters fell under this umbrella, though unlike Naruse, his female leads were less headstrong and more beautifully suffering. He was considered a feminist in his time, though it's been noted that this title was not applied in the same manner between the West and Japan, with the Japanese connotation meaning that his stories simply focused on women, rather than necessarily empowering them. In fact, while he worked with a number of major actresses of the era, namely Kinuyo Tanaka, later director of Love Letter, Mizoguchi was noted for refusing to provide his recommendation for Tanaka to be hired as a director by Nikkatsu.
Regardless of these personal details, Mizoguchi remained a prominent director for his slow, plodding visual style, making use of numerous long takes. While he is most well known for his women's films, this style extended into a number of his works in other genres, including the Jidaigeki, or period film, as is on display in the 47 Ronin. In particular, over their nearly 4-hour runtime, the 2 parts of the film contain a mere 145 shots, meaning that the average shot length stands at roughly 90 seconds apiece. It's remarkable that Mizoguchi could maintain this level of stylistic and artistic integrity when one considers the restrictions being placed on him during this film's production, which are the final reason we wanted to cover this film.
Part 1 of Mizoguchi's 47 Ronin was released on December 1st, 1941, less than a week prior to the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a fact which led to the film not exactly faring well at the domestic box office. As you might imagine, Japanese civilians may have had concerns that outweighed leisure activities like going to the movies. As our American viewers will no doubt have learned in their grade school US history courses, this attack is what finally brought America into the fold of World War II. We say finally because, at least for Japan, the campaigns being carried out in Asia that constituted the beginning of the war had been occurring since 1937. While Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and had occupied Manchuria since 1931, an incident in July of 1937, known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, kicked off the Second Sino-Japanese War. This in turn snowballed into just one portion of the various conflicts of World War II. So while America may have abstained from intervention in the East until Japan's provocation in 1941, the Imperial Army and Navy had already been embroiled in the Second Great War for some time.
Similar to the earlier Meiji Restoration and the cultural resurgence that brought the tale of the 47 Ronin back to prominence, the Japanese government saw fit to promote Japaneseness during the period lasting from about 1936 until the close of World War II in 1945. The thought went that nationalism and patriotism among civilians could be promoted through the arts, leading to advisory boards screening what was released during this era. This was true of certain mediums like written publications, with novels sometimes being banned for the duration of the war due to what the censors saw as their anti-Japanese rhetoric. Perhaps even more so, this censorship extended to the silver screen, with the government crackdown going so far as to restructure the entire industry.
At the time, there were 10 active studios, with independent film still several decades from its emergence. After the officials in charge of film censorship were done with the system, only 3 studios remained, with each of these being cobbled together from the 10 smaller organizations from earlier. After sculpting the hierarchy of their wants, the censors then placed restrictions on film stock. The war effort was extremely expensive, thanks in no small part to the large area of land that imperial troops held, and the number of men this required. This expense in turn led to frequent shortages of goods and resources, with the government either diverting these resources for military use or else halting production in favor of reassigning civilian workers to the production of more necessary materials for the war effort. Thus, film stock was seen as a luxury, but one that the government was willing to fund in small quantities in order to produce films which were effectively propaganda in order to build morale with the common people.
This at first led to a movement away from what was seen as the westernization present in the style of realism, and back toward what the censors saw as a more traditional style of Japanese film. In the early days of the cinema of Japan, films were often composed of steady-angled recordings of kabuki plays. As films began to evolve, with cameras beginning to move around the space of the action on screen, this style remained somewhat true. While the camera was no longer stationary for the duration of a film, directors like Mizoguchi himself were perhaps inspired by these theatrical roots to create their signature slow, methodic visual style that maintains an air of being staged.
During the latter half of the 1930s, this movement back to the roots of Japanese film also saw an increased focus on stories of Japan's past triumphs, such as that of the 47 Ronin, and of morality tales, which today's film also represents. If you look at the directors who were allowed to make films during this period, you'll notice that the masterful directors like Mizoguchi and Yasujiro Ozu, who had worked more freely before, were suddenly restricted to shooting stylized period dramas, rather than the modern-based stories they had shown a predilection for previously. With regards to this movement backward, Mizoguchi himself was quoted after the war as saying that he was, quote, escaping into history in order to avoid the demands of the troubled present, unquote. Unfortunately for his contemporaries, after the incitement to war of the United States, this trend saw a surprising reversal.
Beginning in 1942 or so, the ministry in charge of overseeing film production saw that the films of the era were not necessarily having their desired effects as propaganda, and sought to return to the modernist realism present a decade prior. Essentially, they had come full circle, but this time the function of these films as propaganda became a bit more obvious. The setting of these later wartime works flew forward to the present, focusing largely on the people involved in the war effort. Actual campaigns were glorified, like the attack on Pearl Harbor and the war at sea from Hawaii to Malay, which we mentioned in our episode on Godzilla. Mentor of Ishiro Honda, Akira Kurosawa, and Senkichi Taniguchi, and director of the aforementioned film, Kajiro Yamamoto, produced a fairly significant number of military dramas in this vein during the remaining years of the war. If you look at the career of the earlier masters like Mizoguchi and Ozu, you'll see that during this period their output slowed or entirely halted. Whether this was due to the poor performance of their earlier period dramas, or due to their not wanting to make military propaganda films, many earlier directors would not see the release of new projects until the Japanese film industry slowly reorganized itself during the period of post-war reconstruction.
Kenji Mizoguchi's 47 Ronin represents something of a bizarre fulcrum for all of these events. It shows us how the late 1800s onward saw a resurgence in interest for the stories and values of old, while also showing the second wave of this resurgence, present during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It stands as one of the last morality tales and period dramas produced during the late 30s and early 40s under a rigid system of artistic censorship. The lengthy focus throughout both parts on the planning stages of the revenge detail for us how focused on influencing public opinion the government was at the time, especially given how arguably the most important scene of the film, the assassination of Kira, is entirely missing. For this reason, the film also represents the sanitized vision of military operations the film board wished to present at the time. The 47 Ronin provides us with a stark introduction to the works of one of the few true pre-war masters who continued working throughout the conflict years.
Perhaps most important of all, however, the film proves after almost 80 years its quality in spite of all the odds and in spite of the censorship Mizoguchi had to deal with during the film's production. The 47 Ronin may be slow, lengthy, and methodical, but if you can find a copy, it's well worth examining, either with the conditions under which it was produced in mind, or simply on its own merits.